Hello, welcome back. Now let's talk about the other measure of importance, Betweenness Centrality. Consider this graph of Harry Potter and friends. Again, you don't need to know the story to appreciate this example, right? We have Harry, Ron, Hermione and Dumbledore on one side and Snape, Malfoy and Voldemort on the other. Say for example, Harry Potter wants to spread a damaging rumor about Voldemort. He might say something like, "Voldy got a nose job!" This message has to go through Dumbledore and Snape to get to Voldemort. In which case, Voldemort will hear about it and he'll get very upset and say, "I hate you, Harry Potter!" But what if you take Snape out of the equation? Then Voldy can't eavesdrop about all the stuff Harry's saying about him. Snape, who was our bridge, has been taken out. The two groups are now separated. Communication between the two groups have been disrupted. Of course, in many social networks, we have other alternate paths to pass a message from one person to the other. Our preference will always be for the shortest possible path. But when that person is taken out of the picture, that path is disrupted and it'll take us a while before we can re-establish communication by the next shortest route. Nonetheless, because we have a preference to pass information through the shortest route, the people who reside along the shortest path, they play the same role as a bridge in allowing us to communicate with others. Now, in an earlier video, I talked about the importance of being a bridge, right? So here, the same idea applies. The one with high betweenness centrality functions like a bridge between people. They are important in the sense that they connect one group to another. And more importantly, they exercise power in that they can adjust the flow of information and affect outcomes. If Snape, for example, wants to negotiate peace between Harry and Voldemort, he could choose not to pass on the message, "Voldy got a nose job," to Voldemort. So Voldy will not hear about Harry Potter's nose job rumor. Or Snape could just tell Voldemort that Harry admires Voldy for his wisdom. Why? Because he who has no nose knows best. Alright, so now that I've explained the concept of betweenness centrality, how do we compute it? We need to use a loop. So let me take this opportunity to introduce to you a for loop. The for loop works like this. For each item in the list, and then you perform the set of instructions. Next item. For loops are great when we're working with a fixed list. Here's an easy example. For each letter in the alphabet from A to Z, output the current letter, and then next letter. Here we are basically saying we have a list of all alphabets A to Z. For each letter in the alphabet, display the current run that we're looking at. So what's going to happen? We go A, B, C, D, E, F, G, H, I, and so on until Z. At Z, we have arrived at the end of the list, so the loop will terminate. Now, did you know that you can put a loop in a loop? It's like, yo man, I heard you like loops, so I put a loop in your loop so you can loop the loop with this hula hoop. We call this nested loops. We can do it with the do while and do until loops as well. But here, I like to demonstrate with the for loop because it's so much easier and clearer to showcase it. So let's say we are doing this loop in a loop. Okay, we can call the outer one the outer loop and the loop that's inside the inner loop. Each iteration of the outer loop requires that you finish running every iteration of the inner loop. So let me demonstrate. Let's go back to our alphabet loop, okay? Let's take this and nest it inside another loop like this. For each item in the list from 1 to 5, first output the current number and then perform the inner loop. For each letter in the alphabet from A to Z, output the current letter, next letter. And then once we're done with the inner loop, output woohoo and break to the next paragraph. And then next item, right? Now, for the sake of clarity, because we have a loop in a loop, it's easier for you and I to read it when we use indentations, spaces to mark out how one belongs to the other, how one is nested in the other. So let's explain how this is going to work, alright? Our outer loop will run 5 times, our inner loop will output every letter from A to Z. So what's going to happen? Let's start with outer loop iteration 1. The first line will tell us to output 1. And now, we're in the inner loop, so we're going to put A, B, C, D, E, F, G, H, I, J, K, L, M, N, O, P, Q, R, S, T, U, V, W, X, Y, Z. Now we have finished our inner loop. What's the next instruction? We have to output woohoo! Okay, and then we have concluded our outer loop. Now we go to the second iteration of our outer loop. Again, we will need to output 2, because that's the first line of our code. Inner loop, and we go A, B, C, D until Z. And then, we're done with the inner loop. So now what do? Woohoo! Alright, and then we progress to the third iteration of our outer loop. And so on until our final output looks like this. Ta-da! Now, I hope this has helped to illustrate the logic of how an inner loop operates within the outer loop. Why is this important? Well, there are many problems in this world where we don't just repeat a set of instructions on a set of things. We repeat a set of instructions on a set of things each thing containing its own set of instructions. Now, betweenness centrality is one of those things requiring a loop in a loop. Okay, so let me explain. To determine how important a person is in terms of betweenness, we want to count the number of paired relationships a person disrupts if he or she is taken out of the network. That is, for example, if A died, can B and C still talk to each other or have communications been disrupted? If it's disrupted, we'll count that towards our betweenness centrality score. So we need to check this against all possible pairs of people on the network. That's a bit morbid, alright? So let's illustrate this using the Harry Potter scenario. We have the same graph with Harry Potter and friends. Now let's go through each individual on the network in this alphabetical sequence. Let's start with Dumbledore. How many pairs of relationships will communication be disrupted if Dumbledore dies? Not counting Dumbledore, we have 6 choose 2, that's 15 pairings on the network. Let's see which pairings get disrupted if Dumbledore's dead. Harry and Hermione still can communicate. Harry and Malfoy, disrupted. Harry and Ron still can communicate. Harry and Snape, disrupted. Harry and Voldemort, disrupted. Hermione and Malfoy, disrupted. Hermione and Ron still can communicate. Hermione and Snape, disrupted. Hermione and Voldemort, disrupted. Malfoy and Ron, disrupted. Malfoy and Snape still can communicate. Malfoy and Voldemort still can communicate. Ron and Voldemort, disrupted. Ron and Snape, disrupted. Snape and Voldemort still can communicate. So in total, Dumbledore's death will disrupt a total of 9 pairings. So Dumbledore has a betweenness centrality score of 9. Now, let's try Harry Potter. How many pairs will be disrupted if Harry's dead? Well, everyone can still talk to each other even though Harry's dead, right? So, there's 0 disruptions. In terms of betweenness centrality, Harry Potter is pretty useless in this network. Take him out and information can still pass on without any disruption whatsoever. You get the picture? Now, for each person, we'll check to see how many pairs on the network he or she disrupts. So we have an outer loop controlling the person that we're currently considering, and an inner loop that will check every possible pairing to see if his or her death will cause a disruption in the communication. We can express that in a for loop in a for loop, like so. For each person, the list starting with Dumbledore and ending with Voldemort. And then here's our inner loop for each pairing in the network, excluding pairs with the current person. Now, again, let's apply decomposition to outline what needs to be done, shall we? 1, we'll need a conditional to determine whether there's a disruption. And if there's one, to count it. 2, we'll need to report the number of disruptions after we've considered every pairing in the network. 3, we'll also need to reset the counter that counts the number of disruptions before we move on to the next person. So the conditional is pretty straightforward here, right? Increase the counter by 1 if there's a disruption with that pair. Otherwise, do nothing. Don't increase, right? So we can write it in pseudocode like this. If the shortest path between the pair is disrupted, then increment disruption counter by 1. Let's put that into our loop in a loop code. Here's what we get. Now, when do we report the number of disruptions? It would make no sense to report the disruption counter before the inner loop. We haven't even considered any pairings at all, right? It wouldn't make sense to even report it in the inner loop either, because we'll get too many reports. It's hard to figure out which is the final one for that person that we're considering. It would make more sense to put it in the outer loop after the inner loop. Why? Because this is the time when we have considered all the pairings and counted the total number of disruptions for that person. So let's put it in our code, and here's what it looks like now. Okay, what's left? We need to ensure our counter is reset to 0 before we start counting disruptions for the next person on our list. We can easily set that with a code like let the disruption counter equals to 0. But again, the important question is, where do you put that? In the outer loop before the inner loop, inside the inner loop, or in the outer loop after the inner loop? If you said in the outer loop before the inner loop, congrats! Yay, you deserve to play with a hula hoop. And like that, our code is complete. For each person in the list, starting with Dumbledore and ending with Voldemort, let disruption counter equals to 0. For each pairing in the network, excluding pairs with current person, if the shortest path between the pair is disrupted, then increment disruption counter by 1, next pair. Then output the name of current person, output the disruption counter, next person. We're done with our pseudocode. Of course, the important question is this: how do we know if the code works? We have to run it again, right? It's very lengthy since we have to go through 15 pairs for each person. So let me just fast forward the sequence and you can watch it unfold, alright?
The wizard with no nose. This is the song of Voldemort, the wizard with no nose. He went to South Korea for rhinoplasty, but then in Belgium he lost his nose, and that's how he has no nose. This is the song of Odie, the wizard with no nose. This is the song of Voldemort, the wizard with no nose. He who has no nose should know best, but he isn't that wizard. He has no nose, no nose, no nose.
From this, we now know that Dumbledore is super important as a bridge because he has the highest Betweenness Centrality. Snape comes in at a close second with the second highest score. Now, if you kill any of these two people, then there will be a massive breakdown in communication between the two groups. When we come back, we'll apply our knowledge of social and network analysis to crime fighting and terrorism. See you then.
He's got no nose no more, but he's the nosiest of them all.